Good morning, everyone. My name is Megan Fullman. Pronouns are she, her. And wanted to take this opportunity to echo Kenton's welcome. We are happy to have you all here today. I have the honor of introducing our wonderful workshop facilitator and presenter this morning, Dr. Tylir McKenzie. Wonderful human and faculty here at Highline College in the psychology department. And I think we are in for a wonderful workshop this morning. Very glad you could join us.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate people showing up to a conversation that's really important. So, as Megan said, my name is Dr. Tylir McKenzie. Looking around the room, I think I know the vast majority of you. So, I go by Dr. T usually. I choose that because it's a gender-neutral term. Doctor to represent non-binary is a really effective measure within the academy. So in terms of pronouns, I tend to say I use them all. So she, he, they is fine. No pronouns is fine. All pronouns are fine. And really, my approach that I say to that is, as long as it comes from a place of respect, I don't mind how you read me. And I find that that is what people can function with, right? People have known me historically, know me through a lot of different pronouns because I've shifted. And in the end, I can't even decide for myself, so I largely just say, yeah, any of them are good. It's just fine. So I have the opportunity today to talk to you about intersectionality and in particular intersecting identities. And we did do this as part of a little workshop as a Q group, but we had the opportunity to come and present it to a little bit of a broader audience. And every time I get to do this, I find ways to enhance it more and more. I just realized I left my paper, sorry about that. One of the things I wanted to start with, however, is really wanting to talk about why this week has been important. Like this week we have come together to honor and celebrate the LGBTQIA students, staff, faculty here at Highline, as well as our friends and community allies and families. The queer community continues to expand, right, and redefine the meaning of diversity and gender and sexuality. And while these identities themselves are broad and complex just within these two categories, they do not exist within a vacuum, right? There is more than just those two pieces. So understanding how gender and sexuality intersects with our other social identities, including things such as race and class and age and ability and religious beliefs and political affiliations and educational backgrounds, which is something I feel is often left out, but in a place like here at Highline in the higher education, I think it is something that we have to acknowledge as well. The biggest thing and the biggest reason for knowing that we have these intersectional identities is not just because, oh, I can say who I am and what I represent, but it is the lead-in to advocacy and acknowledgement and activism. Myself, the Q group, the LGBTI task force, CCIE, and all the individuals this week who have worked tirelessly to make this event happen, we want you to know that every one of you is welcomed here and honored in this space for the unique and complex individuals that you are. Our holistic identities is never fixed. Who we are and who we may be in the future shifts and changes throughout our lives, as do the structures, right, and the institutions which influence the privilege and power that we have based on our identities. So whether you identify within the LGBTQIA spectrum or here as an ally, by showing up and by being present, by being visible, is an act of vulnerability and an act of strength. It can be both risky and empowering. But through community actions like this week, we work together to earn the trust of each other through this process of offering respect and space for all of us to exist. While the events this week have been absolutely amazing and magical and fulfilling and inspiring, there are still many in our community, and even many of us, who have been and continue to be subjected to discrimination, harassment, violence, and oppression We hold compassion and empathy for all who experience oppressions. Throughout the acknowledgement, respect, and acceptance of each other, and by actively supporting community events like this, we not only honor one another, but we honor all those who have walked before us, all of the LGBTQIA trailblazers who fought a fight that we can sit here today in this space and have these conversations. And so I just wanted to welcome you to this space and tell you that I'm really glad you're here. And with that, I'll go ahead and start with what we're talking about today. So it's interesting, right? If you've been in multiple events this week, you know that Jalen, our keynote speaker from the Lavender Project, kind of introduced us into intersectionality, and it was really awesome to be like, we're gonna bookend this opportunity to be able to kind of tie it all together, have that through line. So really it comes down to what is intersectionality, right? And it was talked about a little bit, this idea that it was used to look at the systematic oppressions of Black women in systems that it's not just because they were women and it wasn't just because they were Black, but that intersection made them have a greater oppression. And Kimberly Crenshaw really believed that we cannot just look at one aspect. Our intersecting identities are critical to all of us. None of us in this room are just one aspect of our identity. We're going to talk today about the circle of power and privilege. There's a lot of different versions of this, but we're going to use one particular one today to kind of lead us through and talk about in our discussions. And I'm going to offer us a chance to do some self-reflection. And I know a lot of you have probably already done some activity like this, but it always is that opportunity to reevaluate. Reevaluate where you're at, where you're going, what you feel. And in particular, looking in this institution, where do you feel you have privilege? Where do you feel you're more marginalized? And how do we address those discriminations and barriers in particular? So I want to start us off with just a short video. This is one that I show every quarter in my class, just as an example of an actionable item. You can start off with this. It can apply to any subject in any way. And it is a very familiar term for those of us over in the social sciences. Intersectionality is just one of those words we all know and use, but not everybody knows what that means exactly. And sometimes it's just really good to hear it from the source of the person who developed it. So I'm going to start us off, hopefully, with technology working with this video.
Understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves, and they create obstacles that often are not understood within conventional ways of thinking about anti-racism or feminism or whatever social justice advocacy structures we have. Intersectionality isn't so much a grand theory, it's a prism for understanding certain kinds of problems. African American girls are 6 times more likely to be suspended than white girls. That's probably a race and a gender problem. It's not just a race problem, it's not just a gender problem. So I encourage people to think about how the convergence of race stereotypes or gender stereotypes might actually play out in the classroom, between teachers and students, between students and other students, between students and administrators, and commit themselves to understanding that as a way of intervening and providing equal educational opportunity for all students, regardless of their identities. Identity isn't simply a self-contained unit, it is a relationship between people in history, people in communities, people in institutions. So schools do a good job when they understand that and when they commit themselves to curricular development, to opportunities in the school for all students to understand the histories that have brought us to this particular moment. You can't change outcomes without understanding how they come about. So independent schools can take the lead on that to be responsive to their student populations and to the communities out of which the students come.
As you can tell, I definitely was trained in this particular way. My language, it's become part of my normal thing, right? It's something I say all the time, something we talk about, the need to look at these complex identities. And just one way, for example, that you can make that difference is to show your friends this video, to show your colleagues this video, to, you know, introduce it in other spaces where we need to talk about complex identities. Technology, bad. Naughty technology. All right, so intersectionality, you know, there's a very long definition, there's multiple ways you'll see this definition written out, but simply put, it's important to note that it's a theoretical tool to consider the multiple ways that our identities combine, right? To create unique, interconnected experiences of discriminations and oppressions and inequality for individuals. Thinking critically about this, how one's multiple identities, right? How they inform how we navigate and experience the world, and how we navigate and experience higher education is important in conversations about intersectionality. And when we do that, when we look at our own identities and how they influence and interact in spaces, it's often articulated with a term called positionality. And that is kind of how you sum up your identities, whether you have privileged ones or disadvantaged and marginalized ones, to inform your position socially. As a teacher, one of the ways I do that is that I make those statements when I'm talking about subjects that are really important. But it comes from this viewpoint of who I am, and encouraging students to consider it from their own place, their own positionality. When we talk about intersecting identities, it's based on intersectional theory, and it's become another kind of two-folded thing. We have this theory on one side, but we also have this idea of intersectional identities that comes with that. And that includes race, it includes gender, it includes sexuality, religious preferences, ethnicity, culture, socioeconomic background, country of origin. These are just some of the countless examples that become our identities, that represent who we are in certain social positions. What I want to say is, don't be discouraged if intersectionality and positionality are new to you. You would probably use some aspect of it without necessarily knowing that's what you're doing. And that's a beautiful thing, and you can continue to build on that. If we do this while we're discussing things with our coworkers, with our colleagues, with our friends, with our peers, with our families, we help to extend the concept. We help to push the notion of what intersectionality is and how it is so important to understanding social issues. I'm hoping that as we do this today, that you gain some familiarity with it. You can gain your own reflection about who you are and your positionality. And that's really what I'm hoping to do through this presentation with you all today. We are going to do breakout tables. We are going to do discussions, give you a chance to think about it. Because often we may go, yeah, I know what intersectionality is, or I know I have all these kind of different identities. But we are going to kind of tease it out a little bit farther. But again, I want to start off with a couple of short stories. These are both stories that look at how race and sexuality interact with one another, as well as gender, and how that informs life experience. I'm going to start first with Kay Bartlett's.
Kay is a diverse activist, cultural worker, and disability justice advocate. Race and disability, race and gender, race and class. I can't go to a store or a doctor's office or a date and not be seen as brown, trans, with a cane. There's no way. And I'm not going to choose any of those things. I do not want to minimize or dictate how people live and experience and identify. Intersectionality is really super critical to me. I'm not just attacked because I'm trans. I'm attacked because I'm brown and I'm disabled. People are being imprisoned, criminalized, harmed, not given jobs, not given medical support. They're not adequately being loved. It's And it's critical that we get those resources from that community. Every day I'll be on a train and someone will, try to get a seat at the, disability access seating. And depending on that person, depending on how they see me and my masculinity, right? Brown masculinity is not supposed to be vulnerable. Gender nonconformity, you're a girl, and then I'm young, so you're not really disabled. So all of these things are coming into play on a frequent basis. And I have to run at the medical office. When I'm with the doctor, how many times I'm misgendered? So if they see my brownness, we just want to talk about your brownness. When I'm in like queer spaces, like let's just talk about you being transgender or queer. When I'm in very able-bodied, fit, radical people of color spaces, they don't really want to discuss access or the needs of my community being disabled. Real talk, white people are treated very different in the trans community than brown people, than black people, than Latino people. Real talk, people with disabilities, oftentimes it's a lot of white people, cis-sexual, rich people who can afford healthcare, and that is not my community. For me, what's super pivotal is to acknowledge that race doesn't just move everything along, but that it interprets and informs all the other parts of me. It's because somebody is brown and trans. It is because somebody is physically disabled or perceived as crazy, right, and brown and black. And those things inform each other. When somebody says, oh, that trans person of color is so lazy, they don't know how to get a job. Well, A, that's ableism, they can't work. B, is sexism, and C, anti-blackness or racism, right? So all those things are tools, are weapons happening simultaneously on me, on you. I think it's really critical that we engage in dialogue that might make us uncomfortable. If we don't address that depth, our level of depth, and also the level of depth to which we are being harmed and limited, I don't think we're going to be able to really do groundbreaking work or innovative work to address our needs. And in order to do so, we have to not just see race in a vacuum.
So one of the things I want to acknowledge here is that there was a good point being made about how in each of these spaces, right, how the identities can shift, right? That in certain spaces we can have more privilege or we can have less privilege, and spaces can be restrictive, right? That they only want to look at that one piece. They don't want to acknowledge that other piece. And then I'll go with Sonia here for the second one.
Sonia Ginasaka, migrant queer poet, coach and organizer. Race and gender, race and immigration status, race and sexuality. Everything and every way that I'm negotiating my space and the way that I'm accessing space is in relation to how the United States of America is seeing me as this brown woman, as this foreign, as this migrant, as this person with an accent, as this person who's perceived femme or woman. I can come up here and identify as a white woman, but that is not the reality. In migrant spaces, we're fighting for immigration rights, getting that DREAM Act or getting that, CIR. Don't talk about, your reproductive rights, or don't talk about your queerness. Doesn't even take into consideration economic class. Doesn't take into consideration how very English-centered it is. How are we fighting for immigration rights and most of your pamphlets are in English? Like, that doesn't make sense. And then in queer spaces, there's been the neglect to acknowledge immigration or even, undocumented statuses. And then in a general sense, my identity as an artist and a poet, that is always erased in many spaces. We're always doing reactionary work and we're always doing, fighting against this or fighting against something. But when it comes to artists, we're always left behind. That's one of the reasons many of us burn out, because there's no recognizing of all of our identities and showing up as whole beings and showing up as complicated individuals. In this country, what I've noticed is immigration reform has always been about the access to whiteness. Example, we have two borders. Which border is racialized? Which border is more militarized? Which border exists within a racial coded language? That's usually the Mexican border, right? And there's this myth of that there's a border right with Canada. any movements that are advocating for undocumented communities, they're always leaving out Black migrants. Look at all the campaigns, look at even the posters, there's one sort of depiction of immigration and migrants that is very coded under who is now deemed acceptable to kind of uplift white supremacy or whiteness or a certain identity of citizenship in this country. So, and that's many Black communities. I mean, there's the reason why there's anti-Blackness within migrant spaces and non-Black people of color spaces. There's always going to be a policy that is going to be shifted, but at the core of it, non-white bodies are always going to be seen as quote-unquote illegal or as not having any legality in this country. All of my identities are intertwined. I think that having to negotiate with any of them is not going to take us anywhere to the journey of liberation or radicalness or progressiveness that we're actually trying to do. If anything, is the erasure of what has led us here.
So I love these two videos because they talk about all of those different navigations. And one of the things that Sonia says here too, that again, we don't talk about education as being one of those boundaries, right? We don't say it's a social thing, but we also don't look at careers, right? You know, that idea of that being an artist or being an activist is not really a career, and that kind of gets looped into that same idea of marginalization, right? You can be a celebrated artist, but to navigate those spaces, you often have to look at the communities that will accept that part of you and look at that part of you, and then be able to challenge the other ones that are like, oh, you just don't want to actually do these things, you just want to, you know, do this activism, as if it's so separate. Again, none of our identities separate out. So what does this ultimately mean, and why do I want to talk about it in this way? So there's lots of different wheels you'll see out there. The wheel seems to be a very powerful kind of metaphor to thinking about how certain systems work, right? There's the domestic violence wheel. I use that one in some other classes. There's so many that the reason the wheel is a powerful metaphor is the idea that the closer to the center you are, the more power you have, the more protected you are from that outside. And so this comes from Sylvia Duckworth. It's one that I particularly like. I admit I'm a color person, so some of it is that you give me color and my brain instantly is like, I want to read that and look at it. But it's also because it has some aspects that we don't always think about, right? Things like body size, things like neurodiversity. We can lump those sometimes under disability, right? But we don't necessarily see them as their own category. So in using this, one of the things I do is, you know, I'm going to tell you my positionality, right? And the places in which I have power, and ones where I am in that moderate ring, and ones where I'm marginalized, right? So I'm white, I'm a citizen, I have a doctorate, English speaking as my first language. Those are all within the United States, the closest to the center. They have the most privilege in spaces, whether or not I wanted to or not. I exist with more power in a lot of spaces because of that. If I move to my moderate, that kind of moderate power, moderate marginalization, again, we might be thinking of what causes that moderation. And for me, I'm middle class. I rent my housing, I don't own my house. I have some neurodiversity, and that I have a mental health that's mostly stable. I'm going to say mostly stable because I spent the vast majority of my life out in the not stable at all position, right? And I've gotten some power back in having this kind of slightly more stable. I mean, in 2 weeks' time, I'm going to be presenting up at UW Medical School with their second-year med students, talking about navigating the medical system with mental health disability, right? And one of the things I've had to do to try and get that respect, right, is that I have to throw down some of my power cards. So when I used to enter in, I was judged. I was judged for being overweight. I was judged for having all these issues. The second it showed up on my chart that I had some sort of mental health issue, I was immediately kind of questioned about my health issues, whether I was really telling the truth. And I learned through that experience, and being non-binary as well, because it always confuses them. They come, they call my name, it says female on my medical chart. And they come and they look for me and I have a goatee. And then even the ones who are well-trained tend to be like, okay, trans person, non-binary. It still is that moment where it's that awkwardness, right? Where it's like, oh crap, how do I respond? And then I've learned to say things like, without even being prompted, oh yeah, I'm a faculty member, I teach college, right? Oh yeah, I have a doctorate. Because all of those things within our culture are things that are viewed as more privilege, more power. And so in order to be considered more valid in these spaces and to be heard better, I usually have to use those cards to try and move that little bar a little bit closer to being believed. That's the interesting thing about it too. It's that when you're out in the marginalized areas, it's not just about the identity piece itself, it's about how culturally we respond to those pieces. In my marginalization realm, right, one of the things I have loved so much about coming here to Highline and in this group is that I feel seen and validated in my queer and non-binary status. And it has been such a gift that I've gone home multiple times in the last few weeks in tears, just because I feel like I finally have this little space that I can exist. In the rest of the world out there, it doesn't always work that way. When I travel with my friend and we go to, and I'm going to call it out this way, very red conservative states, I pass as male intentionally because it is safer, right? Because I have significant disabilities, but most of mine are invisible. It is hard because to try and get people, well, you're always running around, Tyler. You're always bouncing off the walls. You're Dayglow. By the way, it's a new nickname, Dayglow, because of the hair, right? But it's one of those things that, like, it doesn't mean that tomorrow I'll be able to. But because I don't fit a narrative of what disabled looks like, that's still that hard marginalization. And even within sub-communities, we can still have issues. Even within the GLBTQIA community, bisexuality has long been viewed as problematic. For some, it's no issue. You're part of our group. For others, well, you have straight privilege out there, right? When I transitioned originally, my partner was female, so we were a lesbian couple for all societal appearances. I transitioned, I got a goatee, and suddenly we were a straight couple and treated completely different. But at the time, my partner was also, and she was significantly taller than I am, right? A lot, butcher than I am, I'm gonna go with that word. And so it still had complications because, well, I was perceived as a weaker male, right? So all of these things can flux, even if they just are who you are, it is all about the different relationships that come with that. It's not just those individual identities. This is called the intersection onion. You'll see, I'm going to show you a couple different versions of how this has been approached. What we were just talking about is here in that individual realm, right? My individual identities and how do they kind of intersect and what they do. But then we also have these other broader circles, right? We have this group kind of membership. Are you a student with disabilities? Are there other students? Okay, you have that group membership over there, right? Are you a migrant? Do you have a migrant status? Okay, there's group membership over there, right? That kind of next level. I tend to think of that as maybe more community level, right? It can be your individual communities. We go even bigger. You got the social context. And when we say social, it's typically looking at society, right? And here, right, looking at US society in particular, you have things like power and symbols and difference and attitudes and institutions and privilege and social constructs and social order and capital, right? That kind of personal cultural capital and beliefs. So you can have this one identity over here, but if it doesn't kind of fit within those cultural beliefs, right, how does that change things? And we go even broader, right? We just kind of have that unified system of oppression. The kind of isms, right? Sexism, racism, religious oppression, ageism, classism, ableism. All of those are broad categories, but within that are all of these other groups. So we are constantly navigating not just our small individual inside myself versions, not just in my little community of my family, my friends, my colleagues, not just in the institution like here at Highline, not just in the world out there, but all of this as it exists impact every different versions of our complex identities. Another one I really like, again, Sylvia Duckworth's. I'm telling you it's because I'm drawn to color, but it's a good way to think about these things, right? If you're looking at different combinations, right? How does race, if we look at the race circle, then how does that intersect with all of these different ones? If we look at ethnicity, how does that intersect class, language, religion? And it's not just a one-to-one, right? It's not, oh, this interacts over there. It's overlapping in so many. It's not even just two in most cases. So this is what I would like you guys to do. This is going to be my pause point. And I think Kenton will, if you could help me out. I have handouts for you guys. We have some pens, we can pass them around. What I'd like to ask you to do, if you'd be willing, is to take a few minutes and think about your identities. I'll put up the actual circle again because you'll have the questions in front of you. But think about this. This is one of the things I do with my students, right, as an intro. My identities that I think about most often. What is the thing that is most present for me in these moments? Most present in my everyday waking life. One of mine I'll give you is that mine is my gender, right? When I get dressed, I'm like, I lean in that, I look more male today, okay, I'll lean that way. I don't know, I don't really want to wear that dress, it's not really fitting well, right? My gender is a constant kind of thing that's on my mind. It's one that I think the most about. But then you have ones, what are the ones you think the least often about? You know, these are the ones that, you know, maybe you don't face any real privilege in that moment, or maybe you have that kind of privilege without realizing it, so that's why you don't think about it. But so, we all have something probably within us that we don't concern our brains with every single day. Mine would be my religious orientation, my religious beliefs. Right? I don't have a defined one, and I don't really think about it that often unless there's a reason for me to kind of consider it. So, what do you think the most often about? What do you think the least often about? How do your identities, like what's the ones that you think most affect how people perceive you? Okay? And right now, this is just for you. Okay? I would like you guys to talk, and we'll do a little discussion around it. But right now, just think about it for you. What identities most affect how others perceive you? What identities affect how you perceive yourself? Which ones come together for you that it really say, this is how I perceive myself? And they can be very different than the things that other people perceive about you, that you imagine. What intersections are the most significant to you? That's the back page. That's the one that kind of has that intersection. So it's two-sided, right? The back page kind of has those big, it's called the atom of intersection. Think about which ones are most significant to you, right? One that I know for me, especially because of the work I do, is like, I'm white, I'm queer, and I'm disabled. But how do those come together in certain spaces, right? And I recognize my whiteness gives me power in a lot of those spaces, a lot of privilege in those spaces. But that's one of those intersections that I really am always aware of. What ones do you think are the most beneficial to you, most significant to you? Which ones do you think present the most challenges, right? Which intersections of space and identity can present challenge? And if you can think through these, I'd like to take, we're at, looks like 10:50. I think we have till 11:30, so I'd like to give you guys about maybe 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes to kind of think through. I'll pass pins around so you guys can jot yourself little notes. And then what I'd like to do is just kind of do a small share, give people an opportunity to talk. You do not need to share everything that you wrote for yourself, but you can just have a conversation about what thing really stands out about this activity. What does it bring to mind? And I'll give you those guiding questions when they kind of come back. So if you guys wouldn't mind, just take about 5 minutes. If you need a pin, let me know. I'm happy to bring one around. Let you select from the box, the mystery box of pins. All right, so I'm thinking most people, it looks like you got through a most of them. What I'd like to ask now is if you can kind of group up. I know your guys' table is pretty good. If I can get Carmen, and I don't know your name, so Fred. Carmen and Fred, if you guys want to join together. So you guys at least have 2 to talk to. 3 would be kind of good. It doesn't matter which way you want to go. And here's kind of the questions I just want you guys to contemplate among yourselves within your group is, what reflections in doing this came up for you? Did it highlight something that maybe you hadn't thought of? Did it point out things you already were like, yeah, that's pretty obvious for me? Did anything surprise you about how you think about your own identities and kind of these overlapping spaces? And you know, it's always gonna flux, right? Like if you did this activity even a week from now, you may have some different insights or different experiences. And then last but not least, like in this higher space education here at Highline, kind of the college institution in general idea, do you feel like in your complex identities, do you feel like you have more power in this space? Like as you look through things, are you like, wow, I have a lot of the centralized wheel of power here. I mean, in this space, maybe I do have more power, even if I hadn't thought about that. Or do you feel more marginalized, right? As you look at those ones that really kind of matter and interact here in higher ed, do you go, yeah, this does explain that kind of marginalization outside, right? So I'd like to take, it's top of the hour at 11. I'd like to give you guys maybe 5-10 minutes to kind of just talk out with each other. You're welcome to make a bigger group if you'd like to, and we'll talk that out. And then at the end, what I'd like, if a couple of you might be willing to share out just a little bit, or just kind of what you gathered from your group conversations without necessarily saying, oh, I'm going to talk about Megan. Here's everything I learned about Megan, right? You're more thinking about like our insights kind of said we all have some really interesting places where we don't have privilege or we do feel marginalized, right? So go ahead and take maybe another 5 minutes together and talk through that, and then we will come to a full group. So what we're going to do now is I'd like to do a little bit of a share out. If a couple people, maybe one from each table, if somebody's willing, if more want to, that's great. What we're going to do is I'm actually going to, we're going to record it, like, because the conversation I think is really important. However, please know that if I don't want to scare you from talking, okay? Like, as a group here, I think we'd love to hear anything you want to share. But if you don't want it to be posted out there for people, Bob over there can edit it, and we will just make sure that you're like, yes, I shared, please take my section out. Does that make sense and sound good to everybody?
Okay.
Awesome. Well, what I'd like is if somebody might be willing to volunteer here to share out about, you can either share about like your own personal reflections or kind of like maybe if you noticed any themes that were kind of being discussed at your table, that's fine too. But is anyone willing to give us a start on how you thought about your identities? If the surprising one I think is always the interesting one. Like what stood out, what surprised me maybe too? Nobody likes to go first. It's always the case. There we go. All right, make sure you get this. And please feel free to, if you say your name and pronouns, then we know who you are if you want us to cut it out of the video too. So.
Okay. I'm Lalia, she, her. So what I found with my reflections that I had and what really surprised me, I brought this up in the group, that I do think of a lot of different identities quite often. And I find myself choosing when to share those identities with some people and hiding them from others, because there are some times where I feel like I am not safe and secure enough to share those identities with other people. And I think sometimes I feel like I would just get along better and more quickly throughout my day without having to deal with communicating that with someone else. So that's what really surprised me the most about it.
Very good. Thank you very I think you bring up a really great point about, there are some aspects of our identities we can't hide, right? And I think that's why, race and disability and a lot of those can be so apparent and so important to talk about, because you can't choose that one, right? And I bet if we asked a lot of you in this room that you could probably, I saw heads nodding as you were talking, right? That, yeah, as I navigate different spaces, I decide what to share and what I don't, and you maybe have to earn a certain level of trust, that enter the circle of trust before I tell you that piece. Because we have enough stigma and enough stereotyping in the world that sometimes, like you just said, the effort isn't worth it, right? Like, I'm gonna just go ahead and keep this one to myself because I don't wanna have to explain. I don't wanna have to justify. I don't wanna have to deal with your, oh my gosh, really? I didn't know. Like, it's also dealing with other people's reactions to you, as opposed to just maybe receiving support, which is what we all ultimately want, right? Anyone else willing to share out? It's my job day.
Hello everyone. In my group, we talk about a little bit related with the country and how in different country if you talk about which identity you are, which sexuality you are, which gender you are. So it's really hard to talk about it, especially it's really related with the different country. Some countries are okay to talk about it, some countries are not, especially Asian country. They are really strict about it, I could say that. And also, even though in my group it's all girls, but when we think about in the family, we did play two different roles, which is boys and girls at the same time. Because, for example, in my family, because of I don't have any brother, I don't have any younger sister or younger brother, whoever, only one child. My mom think that I have to be also like act like a boy also sometimes, because sometimes she might need extra help which is she cannot get it from a girl. So I have to be like play two role, like be like a boy, strong enough to lift the heavy thing and stuff like that. Like I talk to my mom like, don't do that, don't do this one, I'll do it by myself. Even though I know that I am a girl, but I still helping her to like doing all the stuff that a girl, the ordinary girl can do it, but I am doing it for that because I feel like she needs extra help from me, something like that. So it's really hard for us to talk about who we are actually. It's really insecure to talk about it, especially in our own country. But it feels different after we came to the United States. It feels like so much different that we can speak out who we are and what we are actually. So it's really different for us.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I think, again, you all reflect such beautiful things, right? Culture, context, what is appropriate, what is not, right? We say gender sometimes as if it's like just, oh, we're just talking about gender, but what we're really talking about is gender expression and gender roles and gender expectations, right? Even within these, what we would consider like these single identity categories, it's not. There's like all of that complexity that lays under it. And I think you pointed out a beautiful intersection there, right? Like it's not just about gender and it's not just about gender roles, but it's like, how does that play out here in the United States? How does this play, from where you're from and where with that kind of cultural and sometimes religious beliefs can come into play to all those, right? So thank you very much for sharing. Can we get maybe one more person who might be willing to share out?
Thank you so much. Again, I'm Kenton Westerfield, they, them pronouns. So one of the reflections that I was having, I was just talking about it kind of towards the end of this discussion. It's funny, I'm looking at the questions here, it kind of hits on all of them simultaneously, but I have been having this very uniquely frustrating experience with like the intersections of my gender recently in within my work as like an employee here at Tylir as an entry advisor, in that while being like non-binary and like internally pretty disconnected from gender overall, I am like assigned male at birth and am almost always perceived as male by people who interact with me, especially like new students or like strangers who are coming in and interacting with me in like my professional context. And within that, I've been navigating this really complicated and frustrating space of like not being a man, but still receiving privilege based on being perceived as male, particularly because all the other members of my team are women, and I've had numerous interactions recently where like someone will come in who probably has like a more traditional, antiquated view of gender and will be treating my female colleagues with less respect than they treat me, even though I am like clearly like very visibly queer and but still receiving that like respect that that is often afforded to men in spaces, and that is both. I'm trying to definitely use that and like turn that to like support my team, but at the same time it's weirdly invalidating and misgendering to be given this privilege that is not truly mine to have in a lot of ways.
Thanks, Ken. Yeah, I would, obviously, we share some similarities in terms of like how gender is perceived on us, and kind of the privilege that's afforded to it just by assumption, right? I was assigned female at birth, and but because I have a goatee, like simply put, it is because I have a goatee, it absolutely goes instantaneously masculine, right? And what's fascinating is that most people perceive me because of my mannerisms and other things that are more feminine in our culture as gay male, right? Like then we go to sexuality. It's like, well, okay, I still have to make sense of these pieces. So it's like, even as, we try to present as all of us do, right? All of those societal kind of narratives still, they just fly around us all the time, right? And a lot of times, one of the things I like to talk about, and I teach a lot about, is the influence of media, right? Not just social media, but media in general, because it defines a lot of these narratives. What does it mean to be a black gay man? What does it mean to be a non-binary queer person? What does it mean to be a white-appearing immigrant, right? And those different narratives of what they are. So thank you for sharing out. I appreciate that. That is always a vulnerable thing to do in a group, to kind of talk about our identities. So the last part I want to talk about is just kind of how do we do something with this, right? Like, so often we think we're like, okay, yeah, we can have a conversation about it. Sure, I'll talk to you about my different identities. I'll reflect on my power and privilege, but like how, I think as Kenton led in, is like, how do we make something actionable, right? How do we not just acknowledge, oh, yeah, that's out there, kind of sucks, like, but how do we actually change it? And there's a couple ideas I kind of mentioned in the beginning, right? Open conversations. Like, that's my biggest push to everyone. Like, just open a conversation. Have you ever heard the term intersectionality? No, I don't even know what that means. Oh, let me talk to you about it. Like, let me help you think about your own. Like, get people into that kind of conversation. And I think here, like with students, with those of you who are students, talking to your classmates when you learn something about like this, and it informs you, talk to your friends. Say, have you ever heard this? I just learned this really interesting thing, and it explained a lot of this, As staff and faculty, let's continue to push ourselves to think about these in a lens of everything we do, right? When something's presented to us, that we also go, am I paying attention to the fact that, is there any ableism in there, right? Is there any sexism in there? Is there any, genderism is not the way we'd say it, but right, is there any transphobia or, homophobia? And a lot of times people think, oh, but I'm not, so they don't look for it. But the most important thing we can do is always be actionable and accountable within ourselves. We can stop ourselves and look over something that we're making, doing, performing, asking, and say, am I paying attention to these kind of intersectional ideas? There's also a couple things, like even as students, right? There's Crenshaw's video that's posted here. She also has another really long one on intersectionality, right? Watch it yourselves, get more informed, inform other people. Tadra Paul's documentary is a beautiful piece about the intersections of race and sexuality. The short film, Love Is All You Need, I'm hoping down the road that we'll show that at one point, but it flips every narrative about what is the dominant norm, right? And then we can add these things to our classroom, right? Doing this simple activity takes all of maybe an hour in 1 week. And I've been really thinking about, do I add this at the beginning, where we can all just know that this is a conversation, and this is a lens we're gonna use. And that way it doesn't become something that's suddenly halfway or through the quarter, we're like, oh, by the way, here's this term. It's like, no, I mean, I tell my students all the time, use this as a lens of critique when you're reading. Is this problematic? Why is this problematic, right? Intersecting Adam, all of those handouts, there's tons of resources out there to help with introducing intersectionality in our classrooms, in our spaces, to family and friends. I'm gonna go ahead and pass question and answer right now. I'm free after this, so if you have questions or answers, I'm happy to hang around to do that. But I do want to kind of close with one last video, which is it's called "See Me," and the idea that queer is just not one thing, right? There's not one narrative that is queer. And given this is the end of our LGBTQIA week, aside from kickball, which I hope we all will come out and see, or at least watch and cheer us on as we try to pretend we know what we're doing. And this is kind of the last part I wanted to add with us. So.
My mom, when I told her I was gay, actually took me to like a psychiatrist. And I remember coming out and the psychiatrist being like, there's nothing wrong with your daughter, she's perfectly healthy. And I was like, yeah, and my mom was like, no.
Watching TV, you see a lot of, fairy tales, and you see men and women getting married, you hear it in songs, just everything, you're surrounded by like hetero norms. So I was really trying to mold myself into what a straight man looks like. A lot of it's kind of a blur because I was trying to be someone other than me.
It was just like kind of like a transition from like, I'm a tomboy to like, oh, I'm like really, really different.
I have a best girlfriend, a friend that's a girl who's my best friend. And about the same time that I came out, she did as well. And it was just really helpful to have two people doing that at the same time, and it kind of brought us closer together.
Even when I was coming out, like, I still had the things that I've heard from like friends and family growing up about, gay people. There were still those attitudes left over in my mind, so I had to like really educate myself and immerse myself into that community and that world.
I've been more comfortable with talking about it, but it's still not something that I'll come out and say, hi, I'm Jen, and bye. One of my closest friends, I've been talking to her about how I had been dating a girl, and I really thought she was really cute, but I also liked a guy too, and she said, she got really fed up with me. She said, well, you have to pick sometime, like whichever one you're gonna be with. What does their gender have to do with how I feel about them?
When people find out you're gay, like, it raises something in them. They feel in danger, they want to change you.
And I've even had a priest once in high school tell me that, I need to redeem my life in my sociology class in front of the whole class. And I had an argument with him, speaking up for myself publicly was a really, really empowering moment for me at such a young age.
There are so many different colors on the LGBTQ spectrum. There's trans, there's, lesbians, bi, gender fluid, gender queer. There's so many subgenres of like, people that exist in our community.
At the end of the day, I really had to accept that there wasn't really a single subculture that was gonna define me. I had to accept that I was made of all of these things, and that all of these identities don't necessarily make me.
Be accepting of yourself, even though other people might not do it. Maybe I lost a few Facebook friends over it, but at the end of the day, that's okay.
How you feel is not what everyone says that you are. I know that sounds a little confusing.
You're gonna have to own it. You're gonna have to get your spoon, you're gonna have to dig down deep and be like, all these layers are mine, and the sooner you do it, the sooner you'll really know yourself.
And with that, I believe that will be kind of the end. I'm happy to share these slides. I did put the link to Love Is All You Need, but I can also share that out. It is one of those things that because it's age restricted and it does talk about self-injury and bullying, that it has kind of those trigger warnings, but I do have it in there in case there's a link. On top of that, I do have a lot of resources, so if anybody wants some of the resources, looking at intersectionality, talking about intersectional identity with spirituality and well-being, the 10 principles of disability justice, which intersectionality is the #1 principle of the 10 principles, right? So there's a lot of links in there that I'm happy to share with you all. And I have a whole bunch of media, videos, TED Talks, things like that that can be integrated into pretty much any curriculum or anything like that. So, and with that, I'm done with that other than to say I appreciate you all being here. This is something I am probably, I probably put myself down a little too much still, but I'm almost annoyingly intersectional, right? Like that's just me. I walk around all the time being like, oh, I don't want to be in that box. Oh, I don't want to be in that category, you know, and it's because as you own who you are, as you start to know that what those labels are out there, while they will always, I mean, I wish I could say they wouldn't, but while they will always exist in some way, that the most important thing is how you define yourself and how you see yourself and how your people and your community support that version of yourself. And so I appreciate all of you being here today and sharing with each other, with me, with the broader population out there interested in helping our work. It's been a pleasure to talk to you all, and if you need anything else from me, I'll have my email and stuff that I can pass to you, and otherwise thank you for a wonderful, small, intimate, beautiful session.